On the screen, an iconic form of Japanese blue and white plate from round about 1620, 1630 era. And as the Japanese started quite late in making porcelain, these are therefore amongst the earliest pieces of porcelain made in Japan. Around the Far East, of course, China and Korea in particular, and others, started to make porcelain, but Japan was not in that position because A, they didn't have the skills, and B, they hadn't found the materials. And so it was the early 17th century before they were able to get started. So what I'm going to do is slightly out of sequence, but I'm going to go straight into what might have influenced them, not only before they started making porcelain, but also as they started in parallel with them making porcelain. And there were two real countries of influence. Korea had an influence, although, to be fair, you don't find very much celadonware in Japanese porcelain, but there's no doubt that Korea was important. And some of the themes that you see on red and white are themes which the Japanese certainly like to reproduce. And if you look at that very gnarly tree on the right, you will see a lot of gnarly trees on Japanese porcelain. And, you know, cranes and other birds in flight are another popular topic which was used by the Japanese. The other thing that the Koreans had is these climbing kilns, which was part of the technology which Japan knew nothing about and needed help on, and this proved to be quite important. The other principal influence, as you would expect really, I suppose, was Chinese porcelain. But in some ways, that influence only started in parallel with Japan starting to make things themselves. And this was because, although there'd been a lot of trade, I mean, the trade was to the Ryukyu Islands, and all of these islands to the south of Japan actually got Chinese porcelain sent in, and then it was moved on into Japan. And the time, the early 17th century, when Japan was starting up, the Ming dynasty was, of course, breaking down, and it was breaking down in a serious way. So really nothing much could be done in Japan, and by 1600 they still had no porcelain at all. But the Chinese, in the fall of the Ming dynasty and in the first 30 years of the 17th century, all of the imperial kilns in China were closed, and those kilns that were private and they were left, and even some of the imperial kilns which were still occupied by people, started to adjust their outlook to try and find things that they could sell to different markets. And Japan was an obvious market to try. The key feature of Japanese porcelain and the porcelain that went in, certainly the blue and white, was that it was made to feed the tea ceremony. And in the tea ceremony, apart from tea utensils, you had little plates that were used for nibbles, and they were often done in sets of 5, and you find the Chinese ones in sets of 5 even today. And I believe that these actually not only reflected Japanese taste, but began to influence Japanese taste. They did both things. It was a two-way symbiosis in which the Japanese, actually, funnily enough, they liked the imperfection of these. These wares were not very good. They were often sanded on the back, and they had various cracks and firing faults and spit out on the front. But the Japanese didn't mind that, because they felt that a pot that had a particular mark on it was an individual pot, and this was an individual feature of the pot that should be cherished rather than ruled out as a fault. So they actually liked these rather poor things, which must have made the Chinese potters really laugh, because they didn't have to try very hard in terms of quality. What they did have to do is reflect what the Japanese said to them. And one of the things they tended to like is quite a lot of white space on their pieces. These weren't crowded decorations, and they both influenced Japanese porcelain, but then when the feedback came, they themselves were influenced by Japanese taste. This is one in my collection. It's a Chinese pot from about 1640, and it's in a tomobaku, which is the box, which the Japanese love to put all their pots in boxes if they're not using them. And this one has this inscription, which says an underglazed blue, middle-sized plate with a scene of a building and a man riding a horse. And elsewhere there's another label on the back that shows that the particular owner who put the label on bought it in 1829. So it had already been around for about 170, 180 years before it was put in that particular box. And some of the finer Ko's Sametsuki wares included these shaped dishes and rather wonderful things of that sort. And moulded dishes like the one on the right. And this is one in my collection with a crane, perhaps, in a flowered background. But again, what they're aiming for, because it is what the Japanese want, is a nice balanced composition with an attractive design and quite a lot of white space. And that was what they were asking for. They liked some of the Chinese subjects, like scholars and students, and they would get wares which from the Chinese that were just decorated simply with scholars and students and nothing else, as examples there. And this, which is very similar to the two plates I showed you at the beginning, is the Chinese original for these plates, which were made by using a tube and blowing the colour onto the area and just masking off areas they didn't want it to cover. So how did it all start? Well, as I said, they didn't have the materials, they didn't have the skills. So it all started when they invaded Korea. And that they did in 1592 in a war that was to last for another 7 years. And during that encounter, they captured Korean potters. I don't know if they deliberately targeted them, but in any case, they found they had some potters in their prisons, and they took them back to Japan. And these potters knew about kiln design, the climbing kilns that I showed you, and they knew about the materials, and they knew how to put the two together and how to manufacture porcelain. And so this really, a Korean potter, there was actually one that was named, and originally it was thought they got started in 1615. Now there's another one whose name I forget, and they're thinking it may have started in 1609. But in any event, a specific group of Korean potters helped get the Japanese porcelain industry started. And this coincided also with a new shogunate, the Tokugawa Shogunate. And this was the first one that ended a lot of civil strife within Japan. So it was the first dominant shogunate that had really changed the face of Japan. And it also, at roughly the time they were starting to make porcelain, withdrew Japan from the rest of the world in the sense that European influence and contact was shunned. And the only thing that did happen that was to be very important was that they did grant the Dutch East India Company the chance to trade from Nagasaki, which was on that South Island, which was close to where actually the porcelain was due to be made. And they introduced a very feudal system of rule. It quite amuses me, really, because you've got all these very important people at the top, and then you get down to that line, 90% of the population were the peasants. And the only people that were worse off than the peasants in this pecking order were the potters and the people who sold the pots. So that was the very hierarchical system which the shogun introduced. And of course, Japan had been making pots for centuries and centuries, but not making porcelain. So there were potting centres all over Japan, but it was on the island of Kyushu over here, and in Arita in particular, with its relative nearness to the port of Imari, that making porcelain was to start. And there's the mark for the area where it started in the Saka precinct. First, they'd found the materials, brilliant. Problem was, they were present together in there, and they were present mixed. And if you went to the left-hand side of the quarry, you got one mix of China stone and China rock, and if you went to the right-hand side of the quarry, you got a different mix of China stone and China rock. The problem is that wasn't well understood when they started, so what they got was a lot of failures. And this is why when you look at very early Japanese porcelain, you'll find it's actually quite thick, and I brought one piece with me, which I put on the table tonight. I brought actually 3 pieces to show you, but one of them is an early piece. And you know, if you used calipers, I mean, I've actually seen some that I think were almost half an inch thick, but most of them are approaching a centimetre thick. And that was because they didn't know initially what mix they had in making the porcelain. And of course, the Koreans helped them build climbing kilns. This is the Hajime, which is the city which is most associated with porcelain these days. And the climbing kilns were built by the Koreans, and they worked pretty well. So the early wares made in Japan had various characteristics. Firstly, they were made in small craft potteries, so they were individual, they weren't in any way regulated. They were noticeably imperfect. There was no standardized approach to the shape or the size, but they did reveal very quickly the Japanese taste. And as I've already mentioned, that included lots of white space. It also included asymmetrical designs, geometric designs, and abstract designs, the great abstract which Robin spoke of last night. And there's a lot that you can see reflecting Japanese art. I have to say, I'm not a Japanese art expert, and I realised that quite a lot of Japanese art was itself influenced by Chinese art. Nevertheless, when you see Japanese art and you start to see compositions on Japanese porcelain, you begin to see the links between the art of the time and that of the early potters. The way in which waves are depicted, of course, the very famous print is much later than this, but this is actually a late 17th century print. And you see that even on a motif in the centre of a dish, so you see things like that on Japanese porcelain as well. And this wonderful abstract method of showing flowing water is used quite extensively, and if we look at the bottom half of this plate, you can see various methods employed to show the ripples in the water and to show the additional ripples made by the legs of the cranes which are standing there. So all of this picked up some of these themes of Japanese taste. And this later pot, which has possibly a scholar on a platform overlooking a waterfall, and you can find a very similar thing being done in Japanese or Japanned furniture, even European Japan furniture, but you can see it in the furniture as well, that these themes are actually picked up. This one has these hoo-hoo birds, as they're called, crazy mad birds. And you do see crazy mad birds, particularly on Kakiemon and some other porcelain made in Japan. And so again, a theme. But let's now start chronologically and look at these very early wares. So some of the earliest ones didn't really have a control over the blue, over the cobalt that was used, and so they appear quite grey or black when you actually see them. But the colours were gradually improved. And what you see is a fairly flat, although quite often slightly undulating surface, where only a minimal amount of it has actually been decorated, hopefully in a rather well-composed way that makes the white space do some work. The early jar here has the beginning of the geometric taste. They liked geometric patterns of all sorts, and these are quite early ones. And here you can see quite how, I mean, obviously this is aged, but it wasn't actually terribly good when it was made either, and you can see that it's quite rough. They have very narrow footbrims to start with. The first 30 years or so, the footbrims are terribly narrow, and they do start to widen a little bit. But that one, well, it's not really very well painted either. It's just imperfect. But, and here's another one from which you can see that very small footbrim. But these are quite small dishes. They're typically 5 or 6 inches across, maybe 7 at the most. There are different sizes, but the most popular size is probably only 6 or 7 inches across. And the jars of the time, again, very simply decorated. And this is when it begins, to me, to get a little bit more interested, when they start to decide, well, we'll put a geometric pattern on one side of the plate and we'll just have some white space on the other. And it's not something you really see going on in any other country at this time. And in a way, it's a very modern concept that they're using there. And you can see when you look at the paste, when you look at the back, that it's a bit like the Bosphorus Sea. It's quite wavy and a very thick glaze put onto it. And this is mine. This is one of the ones I put on the table. And you will recognise that as a border pattern on English porcelain, but actually it's done to signify water here. So this bird is sitting on a branch overhanging some water, and the hatching is actually the water. And this one, showing the variation, because there's no standardization, does have a somewhat wider footprint than the ones we saw earlier. And this is a very small one, probably just saucer size. The use of colour has not really been very successful. It is a Chinese theme. And then we come back to the British Museum image, which is, they're really iconic, these plates. For the blue and white, you still only have to shell out about 20,000 for one of these. But when you compared with the excesses of valuations of Chinese porcelain, Japanese porcelain remains very good value. There aren't many things that sell for 5 figures in Japanese porcelain. This is one example which certainly would. And remember, I showed you the Chinese original, which was made in the 1620s. And you have these wonderful scenes where, to portray a landscape, you just put a couple of mountains on the top left, and to portray water, you put some swirls at the bottom, and the heron, or whatever it is, gazes upwards into the sky. And it's really, I think, personally, I think it's quite appealing. Very simple, and very appealing. And the back is demonstrating there something which soon becomes obvious, and that is that they are using stilts. In this case, just one, which of course messes up the mark. But a sign of Japanese 17th century porcelain, which goes right through the 18th century and at least halfway through the 19th century, is that there are always stilt marks on the bottom. And so they can easily be compared with Chinese porcelain, which very rarely, if ever, use stilt marks. And you'll see some more of those later on. In about 1640, finally we got to polychrome. There was really no polychrome porcelain done before that date, and some of them, like this one, were completely coated in a glaze. And again, very, very simple decoration, but very artistically composed around the edge. And they did use quite strong colours, browns and reds, and sometimes greens, which seem from a distance that are almost difficult to distinguish between them. And this was, they didn't really have much mixing or skills in mixing of colours in the very early days, and you see these very dark colours being used. These in a sort of slightly blobby fashion, but nevertheless on on a dish that has been very nicely moulded. They very quickly learn to mould, and that one is a good example. And this one is a reasonably unusual example of celadon type wares being made in the early days. Again, they start to be slightly better painted, but they don't in any way use subtle colours at this point. Things have to change as time goes on. This dish is probably a good example of everything developing rather positively, because you have an interesting, slightly random geometric pattern. You've got very well moulded and interestingly shaped dish as well. So that's rather a fine piece from the 1650s, which shows that if they wanted to, they could make some quite good pots by then. And the one on the right, I think, is extremely modern in its appearance, really. It's just minimalist, a little bit of moulding and a little bit of painting, and it's very striking for the reason that Japanese art is striking. It's quite different from other places. And this one, which is smothered in colour, interesting. I don't know how much I like it, but the use of colour all over the place did become more popular. Certainly it was more likely with Polychrome than it ever was with unglazed blue. And here there's nice pot with leaves around it. So by the time it got to 1650, the industry started to look to try and standardise more. Firstly, because of the source of the stone, they were keen to centralise around Arita, and the industry started to do that. And some of the craft potteries were probably merged into larger ones. Some of them joined in, though, on the other aspects of it, was that they were trying to standardise more. They were standardising the sizes of plates that would be offered for the tea ceremony. They were standardising footprints and other aspects. And they were beginning to look, despite the inward-looking government at the time, they were starting to look at exports as well. And you can see, if you look at blue and white from post-1750, you start to see dishes which actually, some of those dishes got completely different patterns on the front, but they've got identical patterns and use of lines on the back. These are very small, so you can't see. You can possibly just see the still marks there. But these all look alike, even though they've got different patterns on. And that kind of standardization quickly became the norm. And it becomes very obvious when you look at the later wares and you compare a pattern which is probably based on the Chinese one, but when you look at the bottom, one is unmistakably Japanese and the other is Chinese, and it's very easy to tell where they come from. Trade relationships started to get a bit constrained in the Far East, not least because of the collapse of the Ming dynasty. And the Japanese were concerned about Catholic interference and made it very difficult for Europeans trading with Japan. And at that time, they expelled the Spanish, the English gave up, and they actually forbid overseas travel by most Japanese people. What they did do, they'd already allowed the Dutch a concession in the past, but they decided to trap them on Deshima Island and not let them out. They were allowed to stay there, and with Chinese porcelain production reducing massively because of the disruption at the end of the Ming era, they started to ask Japan to make popular plates that they bought from China so that they could be exported. And in 1759, the Dutch East India Company started on contract with the Japanese. This is a map of Nagasaki, and that is Deshima Island, and that is the little bridge which takes it to the mainland, which many people were not allowed to cross. There it is. And there's another view of it. So they basically were trapped on the island, and in order to occupy themselves, they started to order. There you are, so an even more close up. So there's only, 50 to 100 people on the island, doing all the trading with the Dutch East India Company. And they even had what became called Deshima Island scenes. You get people with Dutch hats wandering around. That's a particular kind of porcelain which reflects this fact. But of course what reflects it more than anything is that the VOC started importing crock designs which had been made previously by the Chinese, and the crock wares had been in evidence as early as 1575, certainly 1595, bought from China and imported back to Europe. But now it was the Japanese that were doing this. And the Japanese crackwares, apart from the steel marks, you can actually tell that something is Japanese. They do tend generally to have a slightly darker blue. And they're a little bit stilted because quite honestly the Chinese ones in some ways were quite slapdash. But there's no easy flash of a paintbrush here. Someone's been very, very careful, and it's much more stilted as a result. But nevertheless, and of course, unfortunately, they were more expensive than the Chinese as well. So it wasn't to be, and it was a very good period for the Japanese industry, but as soon as China came back on stream, it sort of died away again. So between about 1670 and 1700, you get a rush of exports, and then it tails off again. And these are all Japanese pieces which look very much as if they might have been Chinese. But at the same time, the Japanese were making things for their own market, and in doing so they were demonstrating the kind of taste which I've already described. And the use of geometric patterns began really, I would say, in about 1680-ish. And these patterns, which are quite similar to some of the things that you find later, possibly on Saturday, Paul will mention the ascetic period where in England they were copying Japanese themes, albeit not very firmly, but so these geometric patterns started off and they became popular, and they are minimalist with lots of white space yet again. And this one, and you can see still that there are faults on these pieces. They've got sort of iron popping out of the glaze all over the place, but they are attractive. And this one, like a number of Japanese themes, is based on pieces of paper laid on top of a surface. It's supposed to be sheets of paper with drawings on them. This little bowl, and this one, which is I like very much. It's in my collection, so I need to like it really. Again, a hare jumping over the waves. And this is the whole of the plate I showed you the bottom half of earlier on. And you can see that gnarly tree reflecting influences all the way back from Europe and from Japan, and the cranes standing in the water. And it's, I think it's a rather beautiful thing. That's another of the ones I brought with me, so you can see it tonight. And another bowl which combines geometric patterns with the flower sprays in the middle. And this is almost totally bonkers. What you've got there is a mandarin duck, that's the beak, and there's a mandarin duck up there. And are they amid the waves, or are they amid the clouds? And that's the landscape in the background. It's totally potty, but it's unique and Japanese in every aspect. Some pieces were very simple, just little tiny landscapes. This would be from a set of shaped dishes. And others just used simple themes, and they were combined with moulding the rims, and sometimes the rims are just moulded, in that case just with a curvaceous pattern. In other cases they were sometimes used with characters moulded into the border. And they started to make quite big jars and quite big plates by now. They'd certainly mastered making large things. They were quite good at that. and I think I showed you a Korean jar with a flying crane on and here it is repeated in a Japanese teapot. This is an apothecary jar which underneath has the letters IC on it. And when I first started collecting, and I had probably books that were slightly older, they said, well, this is the initials of Johannes Campus, who was the head of station for the VOC. And it was actually made for the VOC, and his initials were put on the bottom. And the initial looks like an IC. And I think it was George Welshaw, one of the dealers in London, who pointed out that it might have been lemon juice, because IC also stands for lemon juice. But I think we can say it could have been either, and I have the proof myself, because this one has some initials on the body, which may be the initials of someone at the VOC, and underneath it has IC, which might be for lemon juice. So two different letters can't be two different stuff contained within. So I think it's either of those things. And here's a theme with a sort of banded ribbon in a geometric pattern. That one was copied in England quite a lot. And so, and you can see even now, we're probably 1670, 1680, 1690, but still got a lot of faults on the paste. This is rather a wonderful jar, which was in the collection of Sam Jennings, who wrote one of the first books on Japanese porcelain. It's in my collection now. This is a hoo-hoo bird flashing its feathers. And you get these strange creatures just put onto the white with a little bunch of flowers and a tiny leaf sprig. And it is not untypical of the Japanese wares to have this restrained form of design. And here's another with a moulded rim and just a little landscape, just a little dappled landscape, done very simply, done quite quickly, but leaving lots of white space. And the composition, I think, is one of the key features of these wares. This is probably blue and white from the Kakiemon kiln. They did actually make blue and white. And again, it's a slightly puzzling scene, and certainly not to scale or any perspective in it at all. But nevertheless, it's got balance, and it's rather interesting. And this one too is probably from the Kakiemon kiln. And you see the wheat sheaves down below, and the gnarly tree, and the hoo-hoo bird all in one design. And here's that plate which I showed earlier with the two scholars looking out at the waterfall. And you can at least see that it is a waterfall and it is falling in downwards. I say that because some of them are absolutely mad. Now here's a wonderful thing. That I don't think it's a Deshima Island plate, although it's similar in concept. And you can see that the figures in the background and the actual boat with a man on it in the foreground seem to be somewhat out of scale. There was no perspective at all in these drawings, and they basically just put the bits they wanted to emphasise and made them a bit larger. But sometimes their flower sort of landscape things were more attractive and better balanced, and this one actually covers a lot of white space as well. And this is late 17th or early 18th century. And this dragon is certainly 18th, I would think. Another one which shows the compositional skill of the Japanese artists. You know, these things look very nice when you display them all together. This is another with ho-ho birds on. And that is beginning to be a bit crowded now, and that did change. The style changed in the early 18th century to a certain extent, although old themes did get repeated as well. As far as the later Polychrome wares are concerned, well, of course, imari is a well-known concept, albeit it was only a port, it never was a style, really. And of course, this was exported and began to be copied all over Europe was therefore very popular and very successful, and of course is still made today. And other colours were used in these compositions to make them something that wasn't really imari, but you do get later on in the 18th century some very completely coloured polychrome plates. And you also get figures of one sort or another, which I'm not very expert on, but they're very sought after things. So the prospectus is being widened in terms of what the Japanese could make and in terms of what they actually wanted to export. They were trying harder to export by then, but they're still bringing in their little geometric designs into the centre of this plate. And they're using colours on shapes which are from Chinese porcelain and exporting them in polychrome. This little dish in my collection is only about 5.5 inches across. It's very pretty. I think it's 18th century. I'm not absolutely sure, to be perfectly honest, but it's just very pretty. So perhaps the best known polychrome of this period is Kakiemon. And the Kakiemon family started their business in the 1640-ish, and they started it purely as a decorating establishment, and it seems likely they probably didn't start building kilns till about 1670, 1680. But of course, Kakiemon output was widely exported by the Dutch East India Company to start with, and it began to influence, you will probably know that almost every European factory of any note made Kakiemon-inspired wares. So of the Japanese polychrome of this era, it is of course the best known of any of them, and there are some fairly wonderful examples, and some people will be able to think of Worcester or other copies of these things which were quite accurate and quite true to the original, and there are copies in France and in Meissen and elsewhere which actually are quite true to the originals. So these wonderful and well painted wares really spawned a fashion which spread throughout Europe completely. And they were, I would say, by far the most successful stylistic influence on Europe, anything that came out of Japan. Moving on, this chap, looking very, very sombre in one of his many self-portraits. Van Gogh, slightly concerned, I should think, of his brother, turned up in Paris in 1886 in a fairly dark mood, and told his brother he wanted to move in with him because he wanted to be in Paris where the other artists were. And this was probably fairly horrendous. I don't think his habits were very fine or nice, and he was certainly in distress. And that's actually probably portrayed by the way in which his very dark and sombre painting was at the time. And he was introduced to this lady, who for just 3 or 4 months became his muse as well as his artist model. She'd posed for other artists in Paris. But she also had a cafe, and during his trip in the 1880s to Paris, he became obsessed with Japanese art, and Agostina allowed him to display his work in her cafe. And this is, I think, a very good single example of the influence of Japanese art on Europe, because it absolutely changed what Van Gogh did. He actually started to look at Japanese art and make his own paintings. Some of them were copies, some of them were original compositions. And he started to make things which were full of colour. They were no longer sombre in any sense. So that only a year or so later, Agostina, who looks slightly sorry for herself in this painting, well, she still isn't smiling, but the colours and the use of colour in the painting that he did a year later is completely transformed the way in which his art works. And when you look at the self-portrait and you look at the one he did a year later, they are completely different. And the use of colour was inspired by Japanese art, even though the actual paintings generally weren't. The ones I showed you were, but he changed completely while he was there. And I think Japanese art has something to do with it. And I've already shown you Kakiemon, which I think was highly influential, and some of the geometric patterns which were picked up in the aesthetic movement by potters in London. But I'm going to finish by showing you something that, unless you are interested in Japanese porcelain already, you might not know much about. I've managed to misspell it there. It's Nabeshima, it's got an E in the centre. And these were produced in Japan from about 1670, but they were produced entirely for the shogun and for the ruling family. And they were not exported at all. They were made for the family, they were given to people overseas, sometimes as gifts, and they were absolutely of the highest quality, and everything that wasn't of the highest quality was not allowed past. So in a sense, they're the Japanese imperial porcelain. And they are quite unique in their style. They are shaped usually in a quite different way, which I'll show you in a minute. But they use a lot more colour and a lot more coverage than some of the things we've seen before. But the quality of them is just fantastic. And here's the underneath. So what you see there is a very deep foot and a very prescribed way of decorating underneath. And you also see there are no stilt marks whatsoever. So obviously they found a way to avoid the stilt marks when the shogun didn't want the stilt marks. And here you see Japanese art almost transcending the period in which it was made and looking like something that was perhaps made in the last 50 years, because you've got slightly abstract designs still on Japanese themes, but things which you might expect to see on modern pieces which were made in the 1670s and 1680s. And although this one is quite clear, it's got the same pattern as one I showed you before, there were actually several prescribed patterns that were allowed underneath these dishes. They all had these deep foot rims, and there were various ways of painting the foot. And there's a very good book this is from, by Motosuke Imaizumu, and I think you can sometimes get it on eBay for about £15 or something. It's a very, very economic picture book of Nabeshima wares. But these wares are just, some of them, quite amazing. And they did blue and white, as an example of the blue and white. And the best of these polychrome ones, there's another blue one, and it's a geometric pattern with fruit or gourds or something on it. And that one, just a composition of a tree and blossom. And these completely geometric. Again, you might expect those were made quite recently, and you might expect to find them in some trendy shop somewhere in London. But for these things to be done then, and for no one in the rest of the world to know they were being done, is fairly amazing. Now, when they do escape and come into the Western market, they sometimes make £75,000, which again is the top price for a Japanese polychrome ware, I would think. This one has what might otherwise have been thought of as water, but being changed into clouds now. They must be low cloud because it's going right through the tree. And this one has a swirling river between plants on the bank. But they are, if you like that sort of thing, I think they're absolutely beautiful, and I think they're so unusual, and they're so rare. I have what probably is a 19th century accurate reproduction of one, which I'll put on the table tonight. But these wares really show that Japanese art was different to almost anything else, and that makes quite a lot of Japanese porcelain different to everything else, which actually is why I love it so much. This you might have thought of as being made today. Again, it was made around 1670. And that's the end. Thank you very much for listening.